November 27, 1982, New Holland, Pennsylvania. A Saturday evening when the temperature drops below freezing and darkness comes early to Lancaster County. In this isolated corner of America, horse-drawn buggies still leave deep tracks in dirt roads. Men with long beards wear black suspenders and wide-brimmed hats. Women dress in homemade dark garments that reach their ankles. Here, time seems frozen somewhere in the previous century. This is Amish country, a place where telephones don't ring, electricity doesn't flow, and faith is supposed to protect against all evil. But on this particular evening, evil walks freely across a simple dirt road. And a woman carrying boxes of cauliflower has no idea she's walking toward her own death dot. To understand what happened on that frozen November night, we need to understand New Holland. This wasn't just any small Pennsylvania town. This was the heart of one of America's oldest and largest Amish settlements. Founded in 1737, nearly 250 years of tradition, prayer, and isolation from the modern world. The Amish live by strict rules called the Ordnung. No cars, no electricity, no telephones, no photographs. Education ends at 8th grade. Clothing must be plain, handmade, and dark. Men grow beards after marriage, but never mustaches, a tradition dating back to their rejection of military service. Women wear prayer caps and dresses with no buttons, only pins and hooks. Every aspect of life is dictated by scripture and community consensus. ***, these rules aren't arbitrary restrictions. The Ordnung represents centuries of theological reasoning about how to maintain separation from a world the Amish view as spiritually corrupt. Electricity connects homes to outside power grids, creating dependence on worldly systems. Cars promote individual independence over community reliance, allowing people to travel far from home without the natural limitations of horse and buggy. Telephones interrupt the rhythm of agrarian life and invite outside voices into the sanctity of the home. Each prohibition serves a purpose, however strange it might seem to outsiders. The Amish have watched the outside world embrace technology after technology, each one promising to make life easier, and they've seen how those same technologies have eroded family bonds, weakened communities, and distanced people from God. ***, but perhaps most importantly, the Amish are pacifists. Violence of any kind is forbidden. They don't serve in the military. They don't fight back when attacked. And they certainly don't kill. This commitment to non-resistance isn't passive or weak. It requires tremendous strength to absorb violence without retaliating, to forgive enemies without condition, to love those who hate you. The Amish martyrs of the 16th century went to their deaths singing hymns, refusing to renounce their faith, even as they were burned alive or drowned in rivers. That same spirit of peaceful resistance continues today. In November of 1982, no one in Lancaster County could remember a single murder within the Amish community since its founding. Not one in 245 years. Crime existed in the outside world, the English world, as the Amish called it, but it didn't touch them. They were separate, protected by faith and isolation. That Naomi Huyard embodied everything the Amish valued. Born on July 2, 1932, she was 50 years old that November. Unmarried, which wasn't uncommon in Amish society, where not everyone found a match within the limited community. She lived with her sister in a modest farmhouse, the kind of simple wooden structure that dotted the Lancaster County landscape. 2 stories, white paint weathered by decades of harsh winters. A small porch, windows without curtains because decorations were considered vain. ***, the Huyard farmhouse sat on about 10 acres of productive land. Not large by modern agricultural standards, but sufficient for 2 women living the Amish way. They grew vegetables in carefully tended gardens, the rows straight and weed-free, everything planted according to centuries-old wisdom about what thrives in Pennsylvania soil. They kept chickens in a small coop behind the house, collecting eggs each morning. A dairy cow provided milk for drinking and making butter and cheese. Every morning began before dawn. Every evening ended with prayers. The rhythm never varied. Spring meant planting. Summer meant tending. Fall meant harvesting. Winter meant preserving and planning for the next cycle. Naomi weighed barely 90 pounds. Frail as a wounded bird, neighbors would later say. But fragile in body didn't mean fragile in spirit. She was known throughout the community for her kindness and devotion. She helped with quilting circles, attended every church service held in rotating homes every other Sunday, and never spoke ill of anyone. In a community that valued humility and service, Naomi was beloved. Her quilts were particularly admired, the stitches so small, and even they seemed almost invisible, the patterns traditional, but executed with extraordinary skill. She had a gift for choosing fabrics that complemented each other, creating beauty within the strict constraints of what was considered appropriate. Dark blues, deep purples, forest greens. Never anything bright or flashy, but still beautiful in their simplicity. She rarely left home. The Amish world is small by design. Everything you need exists within a few miles. Your church community, your family, your work. Naomi had no reason to venture beyond the boundaries of her farm and the neighboring properties. Her life followed predictable patterns, like the seasons themselves. Spring planting, summer tending, fall harvest, winter preservation. Across the dirt road from the Huyard farm, less than 100 yards away, stood another house. This one belonged to the Hare family. John Hare, 60 years old, worked as an industrial custodian, one of the jobs Mennonites could hold that Amish typically wouldn't. The Hares were Mennonite, not Amish, similar, but different in crucial ways. Mennonites and Amish share the same historical roots. Both descended from the Anabaptist movement in 16th century Europe. Both fled persecution. Both settled in Pennsylvania, seeking religious freedom. But over centuries, they diverged. Mennonites allowed more contact with the modern world. Some drove cars. Some had electricity. Some used telephones. They wore simpler clothes than the English, but not as plain as the Amish. The split between Amish and Mennonites happened in 1693 when Jacob Ammon, a Swiss Anabaptist leader, pushed for stricter church discipline and more complete separation from the world. He wanted members who violated community standards to be shunned completely, cut off from all social contact until they repented. He insisted on foot washing as part of communion services. He demanded simpler dress and more rigid adherence to tradition. When other Mennonite leaders resisted these reforms, Ammon and his followers broke away. The division remains to this day, with Amish communities maintaining the stricter interpretation while Mennonites adapt more readily to changing times. The relationship between Amish and Mennonites was complex. They worshipped separately, but lived as neighbors. Intermarried occasionally. Did business together? The Huyards and the Hares had such an arrangement. The Hares owned a large freezer in their garage. The Huyards, like many Amish families, produced more vegetables than they could preserve through traditional canning. So they rented space in the Hare family's freezer. A practical arrangement between neighbors. Simple, mutually beneficial. John Hare and his wife Lillian had 5 children, 3 biological daughters and 2 adopted sons, Jimmy Lee and Raymond, taken in as toddlers. On paper, it looked like a good Christian family, church-going, hardworking, the kind of family that embodied Mennonite values. But something had gone wrong with Jimmy Lee. Jimmy Lee Hare was 18 years old in November of 1982. Adopted as a young child, he'd been obedient in his early years. Attended church. Followed the rules. But adolescence brought transformation. Dark transformation. He began to scorn his parents' religious habits. Skipped church. Mocked prayers. His eyes carried something his family found disturbing. A void, an anger that had no clear source. Then came the arrests, burglary, breaking and entering, petty theft. Not once, but multiple times. The Mennonite community tried to help. They sent Jimmy to a Mennonite-run youth village, a kind of religious reform school where troubled teens could find structure and faith. Jimmy spent 3 years there. The youth facility was located in rural Pennsylvania, hours from Lancaster County. It housed about 30 young men at any given time, all of them troubled in various ways. Some had substance abuse problems. Some had committed crimes. Some were just rebellious, fighting against their families and faith. The daily routine was rigid. Wake at 5:30 a.m., morning chores before breakfast, chapel service, school or vocational training, lunch, more work, afternoon chapel, dinner, evening study time. Lights out at 9 p.m. No television, no radio, no contact with the outside world except supervised phone calls once a month and letters that staff members read before delivering. The staff believed structure and isolation would break through to these lost young men, would help them find their way back to God and community. For some boys, it worked. They returned home reformed, grateful, ready to join the church and live productive lives. For Jimmy, it only hardened him. Asterisk, asterisk. When he returned home at 16, nothing had changed. He dropped out of high school immediately, rented an apartment away from his family, took a job washing dishes at a local restaurant. Minimum wage, mindless work. His parents hoped distance might help him find his way. It didn't. Jimmy tried to enlist in the army. For a young Mennonite man, this was already a rejection of pacifist values. But the military might provide structure, purpose, escape from the confining atmosphere of Lancaster County. He lasted only a few months before deserting. One friend later told investigators that Jimmy was bored and frustrated by the Amish Mennonite community. He felt trapped, suffocated by rules and restrictions and expectations. More arrests followed, more burglaries. Eventually, Jimmy Lee Hare was sentenced to prison. Not long, just enough time to supposedly set him straight. He was released on parole on November 6, 1982. 3 weeks before, Naomi Huyard carried those boxes of cauliflower across the road. His parents took him back. What else could they do? He was their son, even if by adoption. John and Lillian Hare prayed he'd finally found redemption. That prison had scared him into change. They gave him his old room back. The one in the basement. Jimmy spent most of his time down there, emerging only for quick meals. His parents tried not to notice the way he looked at them, the way he moved through the house like a ghost, the way he disappeared for hours with no explanation. They wanted to believe he was healing, finding his way back to faith. They were wrong, because Jimmy wasn't alone in his darkness. He'd found someone who understood, someone who shared his contempt for the peaceful, restricted world they'd been born into. Ernest James Huppengarner, another young man with a history of petty crimes. Another soul who felt trapped by expectations and rules and the suffocating weight of religious community. Asterisk, asterisk, the two had met through the criminal justice system, crossing paths at the county courthouse during separate hearings. They recognized something in each other immediately. A shared anger, a mutual resentment of the communities they'd been raised in. Ernest wasn't Mennonite or Amish, but he'd grown up poor in Lancaster County, watching these religious communities thrive while his own family struggled. He resented their certainty, their prosperity, their claim to moral superiority. Jimmy resented them from the inside, feeling trapped by expectations he could never meet. Asterisk, asterisk, the two of them spent time together that November, planning, talking, feeding something dark that grew between them. And on November 27, 1982, that darkness would finally break free. Saturday, November 27th, the day after Thanksgiving. The sun begins its descent around 4:30 in the afternoon. Temperature hovering just below freezing. The kind of cold that makes your breath visible, that turns your fingers numb if you're outside too long. In the Huyard farmhouse, Naomi and her sister are processing the fall harvest. Boxes of cauliflower, freshly picked, cleaned, and prepared for freezing. This is how the Amish survive winter. Preservation. Careful planning. Nothing wasted. The freezer space they rent from the Hares across the road is nearly full, but there's room for a few more boxes. Naomi's sister is preparing dinner. Naomi volunteers to take the cauliflower over to the Hares' garage. It's a simple task. She's done it dozens of times before. Cross the dirt road, 50 yards at most. Enter through the side door of the garage. Arrange the boxes in the freezer. Come home. 5 minutes, maybe 10 if she stops to exchange pleasantries with Lillian Hare. Around 5 o'clock, Naomi puts on her black bonnet and heavy shawl. She picks up the boxes of cauliflower. Not heavy, but awkward to carry. She steps out into the cold. The sun is low now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pale pink. Her breath forms white clouds. Her black shoes crunch on the frozen ground dot. She crosses the road, passes the bare trees that line the Hare's property, approaches the garage. The garage is detached from the main house, about 20 feet away. The freezer hums against the far wall. Naomi sets down her boxes and begins arranging them inside. Cold air washes over her face. Her fingers, already numb from the walk, fumble slightly with the boxes. She doesn't hear the basement door of the house open. Doesn't hear the footsteps approaching through the grass. Doesn't sense the two figures moving toward her until it's too late. Asterisk, asterisk, in the basement of the Hare house, Jimmy and Ernest had been sitting in the dim room for hours. Drinking beer Jimmy had stolen from a convenience store. Smoking cigarettes. Talking about nothing and everything. About how boring Lancaster County was. About how trapped they felt. About wanting to do something, anything, to break the monotony. Then Jimmy had glanced up at the small window near the ceiling of his bedroom, the one that looked out at ground level toward the garage. He saw movement. A figure in black crossing the yard. He recognized Naomi Huyard immediately. The Amish woman from across the street, going to the garage where the freezer was. He mentioned it to Ernest almost casually, and something passed between them in that moment. No words, just a look, an understanding, an opportunity presenting itself. Asterisk, asterisk, back in the hired farmhouse, Naomi's sister sets the table for dinner. 2 plates, 2 cups, simple food as always. Bread she baked that morning, vegetables from their garden, perhaps some preserved meat from last year's butchering. The Amish don't eat elaborate meals. Food is fuel, not entertainment. 6 o'clock passes. The food grows cold. Naomi should have been back an hour ago. Maybe she's talking with Lillian Hare. Sometimes the women chat, share community news, discuss upcoming church services. But usually not for this long. And not without telling her sister first. 6-30. Full darkness now. The temperature dropping further. Naomi's sister goes to the window, peers across the road at the Hare house. Lights are on inside. She can see shadows moving behind the windows. But no sign of Naomi. 7 o'clock. Real panic now. Something is wrong. Deeply wrong. Naomi never stays out after dark without telling someone. Never. She's the most predictable person in the community. Routine is sacred to her. Naomi's sister crosses the road herself. Knocks on the Hare family's front door. Lillian Hare answers. She hasn't seen Naomi. Didn't know she'd come over. The cauliflower boxes are in the garage freezer, yes, but Lillian never saw her. John Hare is at work. Won't be home until around 6. Jimmy is in his basement room. Has been all afternoon, as far as Lillian knows. The 2 women stand in the doorway, confusion turning to concern. Where could Naomi have gone? For the Amish, calling the police is almost unthinkable. They handle their own problems. Rely on community, not outside authority. Asterisk, asterisk, the Amish have a complicated relationship with law enforcement and the justice system. They pay taxes, follow most laws, cooperate when necessary. But they prefer to resolve issues internally. Theft within the community. The thief would be confronted, required to make restitution, and forgiven. Disputes between neighbors. The church elders would mediate. Even serious crimes are often handled privately when possible. Calling police means inviting the outside world into their affairs, admitting that something is beyond the community's ability to manage. It's a last resort that carries shame and sadness. Asterisk, asterisk, but a missing woman, especially one as predictable and fragile as Naomi, demands action. Naomi's sister asks if she can use the Hare's telephone. Lillian hesitates only a moment before agreeing. The call is made. Pennsylvania State Police are notified that an Amish woman has disappeared. The police arrive within 30 minutes. This is unusual enough to warrant immediate response. The Amish don't call for help unless something is genuinely wrong. The troopers begin asking questions. When was she last seen? Where was she going? What was she wearing? Naomi's sister provides answers through tears. Black dress, black bonnet, black shawl, carrying boxes of cauliflower, going to the garage across the road. That was 2 hours ago. The search begins. Troopers use flashlights to scan the area. Neighbors join in. In Amish communities, everyone helps. Buggies arrive from nearby farms. Men with lanterns walk through fields, calling Naomi's name. Women check barns and outbuildings. The temperature continues to drop. If Naomi is outside somewhere, injured or lost, hypothermia becomes a real danger. 3 hours pass. Searchers cover every inch of the Huyard and Hare properties. Check the road for signs she might have been struck by a car. Examine the creek that runs behind both farms in case she fell. Nothing. Naomi Huyard has simply vanished. Around 8 o'clock, John Hare arrives home from work. He pulls into his driveway to find police cars, neighbors, organized chaos. His wife explains what's happening. John is confused. He saw nothing unusual when he came home around 6. Made himself something to eat. Jimmy came up from the basement a few minutes later. John asked him to complete some chores. When word of the search reached them, Jimmy volunteered to help. He's out there now with the other searchers. One of the state troopers notices Jimmy. Lee Hare. The young man stays close to law enforcement, almost too close. Asks repeated questions about what they're looking for, where they've searched. The trooper notices something else. Blood on Jimmy's shoe. Not much, just a few spots. When questioned, Jimmy explains he cut himself earlier in the day. Sliced his hand doing work around the house. He shows the trooper a small cut on his palm. It's plausible. But something about the young man's demeanor strikes the trooper as off. The way his eyes move. The way he positions himself near the officers. The slight tremor in his voice. The trooper decides to search the Hare house. Just to be thorough. John and Lillian give permission immediately. They want Naomi found as much as anyone. The family gathers in the living room while troopers move through the house. Upstairs bedrooms, kitchen, living areas. Everything appears normal. Then a trooper opens the basement door. Descends the wooden stairs. The basement is partially finished. Jimmy's bedroom is down here. A small space with concrete walls and a single window near the ceiling. The door is closed. The trooper opens it. The smell hits first. Metallic, heavy, wrong. He steps inside, shining his flashlight across the room. A bed against the far wall. A blanket crumpled on the mattress. Something underneath. The trooper approaches, pulls back the blanket, and there, in the cold basement bedroom of the Hare family home, lies the body of Naomi Huyard. She's partially undressed. Her hands are bound. Her mouth is gagged with cloth. Her 90-pound body shows signs of brutal violence. The frail woman who crossed the road 2 hours earlier, carrying cauliflower, has been suffocated and stabbed. Later examination will reveal 16 stab wounds. 16 times someone drove a blade into her fragile body. Under the pillow, investigators find a knife. The blade is still sticky with blood. The scene upstairs transforms instantly. Jimmy Lee Hare is placed under arrest. John and Lillian Hare collapse in shock. Their son, their adopted son who they prayed would find redemption, in whose basement bedroom lies the body of their gentle Amish neighbor. The other searchers are called back. Neighbors who moments ago were scanning fields with lanterns now stand in stunned silence. This doesn't happen here. Murder doesn't touch the Amish. Violence doesn't exist in their world. But tonight it has. And the victim is one of their own. Naomi's sister is brought to identify the body. The sounds she makes are barely human. grief that comes from somewhere deeper than words. The police must physically support her as she confirms what they already know. Yes, that's Naomi. Yes, that's her sister. Yes, that's the woman who left their farmhouse 2 hours ago to store vegetables in a freezer. Now she's dead in a basement, murdered steps away from where she should have been safe. The investigation moves quickly after the discovery. Jimmy Lee Hare is taken into custody and transported to the Lancaster County Police Station. He denies everything. Says he was in his room, sleeping. Didn't hear anything. Didn't see anything. Has no idea how Naomi's body ended up under his bed. The cut on his hand? From work around the house. The blood on his shoe? Must have dripped when he cut himself. He maintains this story for hours, but the evidence tells a different narrative. The knife found under his pillow is identified by his mother. It belongs to Jimmy. She's seen it dozens of times. The blood type matches Naomi. Forensic examination of the basement room reveals signs of struggle. Fibers from Naomi's clothing. Blood spatter patterns that indicate she was attacked in that room. And there's something else. The amount of violence. The brutality. The investigators suspect Jimmy didn't act alone. They press him on this. Who was with you? Who helped you? Jimmy refuses to answer, but his silence speaks volumes. The police begin looking at his known associates. Other young men with criminal records. Other troubled souls who might share Jimmy's darkness. One name emerges quickly. Ernest James Huppengarner. Another youth with a history of burglary and petty theft. Someone Jimmy has been seen with frequently since his release from prison. 3 weeks earlier, Ernest is brought in for questioning. He denies involvement. Says he wasn't anywhere near the Hare house that afternoon. But he's nervous. Sweating despite the cold. His story has inconsistencies. Where exactly was he between 5 and 7 p.m.? He can't quite say. Who can verify his whereabouts? He struggles to provide names. The investigators see guilt written across his face. They just need to extract the confession. Days pass. Then weeks. The preliminary hearing is held in mid-December. Lillian Hare takes the stand. She's aged years in the 3 weeks since Naomi's murder. Her hands shake as she identifies the knife found in Jimmy's bedroom. Yes, it's his. Yes, she's certain. She breaks down in tears. Her son. The boy she and John adopted as a toddler. A child they raised in faith. How did this happen? When did he become capable of such evil? The case generates enormous publicity. Not just locally, but nationally. Time magazine runs a story in early January titled Shattered Calm. The article describes the peaceful Amish community torn apart by violence. Focuses on the stark contrast between the Amish values of forgiveness and the brutal reality of Naomi's murder. Journalists descend on Lancaster County. Cameras, reporters, the Amish, who avoid being photographed as a matter of faith, find themselves at the center of a media circus. The Huyard family responds in a way that confounds outsiders. They offer forgiveness. Isaac Huyard, one of Naomi's brothers, speaks to reporters while painting a shed on his hilltop property. He quotes scripture. Resist not evil, but overcome evil with good. The Amish have already forgiven Jimmy Lee Hare. Already forgiven whoever helped him. This is their faith. This is their way. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemies. Forgive those who trespass against you. David E. Huyard, 75 years old, Naomi's uncle and the family patriarch, offers a different perspective. He suggests the murder is symptomatic of a growing rebelliousness among Amish and Mennonite youth. Young people taught to live peacefully according to Scripture are rejecting those teachings. Drawn to the outside world. Frustrated by restrictions. We're being tested and tried in many different ways, he tells a reporter. I believe we can survive, but I don't know how long. Meanwhile, the investigation continues. Prosecutor Rick Sheets, a young attorney in the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office, works the case relentlessly. He knows Ernest Huppengarner is involved, knows Jimmy didn't act alone, but proving it requires a confession. The physical evidence ties Jimmy to the murder conclusively, but there's nothing that directly implicates Ernest. No fingerprints in the room. No witnesses placing him at the scene. Just the gut feeling of experienced investigators who recognize the signs of a two-person crime. Sheets arranges for Ernest to undergo a polygraph examination. The machine itself isn't admissible in court, but the examiner conducting the test is highly skilled at extracting confessions during the process. The session lasts hours. Question after question. The needles scratch across paper, recording physiological responses. Heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, skin conductivity. The examiner watches Ernest's face as much as the machine readouts. Sees the moment when resistance begins to crack. The questions become more specific, more detailed, more accusatory. Ernest's story falls apart. Contradictions pile up. The examiner pushes harder. Explains that Jimmy has already implicated him. That lying only makes things worse. That confession might show remorse, might show he's not a monster. Finally, after hours of pressure, Ernest breaks. He confesses. The details are horrifying. Ernest and Jimmy had been in the basement when Naomi entered the garage. They could see her through the window. Watched her arranging the cauliflower boxes in the freezer. Something passed between them in that moment. Some wordless agreement. They moved quickly. Out the basement door. Across the 20 feet of frozen ground. Into the garage before Naomi could react. They grabbed her. Dragged her toward the house. She tried to scream, but Jimmy covered her mouth. She weighed 90 pounds. Between two strong young men, she had no chance. They pulled her through the basement door, down the stairs, into Jimmy's bedroom. She fought, scratched, tried to bite. But she was so small, so frail. They overpowered her easily. What happened next defies comprehension. The assault, the suffocation, the stabbing, 16 wounds. 16 separate moments when a blade entered her body. Ernest and Jimmy took turns, feeding off each other's violence. There was a sexual component to the attack, something the autopsy would confirm. This wasn't just murder. It was brutalization, the destruction of a helpless woman who had done nothing except cross a road carrying vegetables. When it was over, they hid her body under the blanket on Jimmy's bed, cleaned themselves up, changed clothes, hid the knife under the pillow. Then Jimmy went upstairs like nothing had happened. His father came home around 6. Jimmy emerged from the basement shortly after, ate something, did chores when asked. When the search party formed, he joined it. Walked through fields calling Naomi's name, stood next to the state troopers, even asked if they needed help searching his own house. The confession is crucial. With both Jimmy and Ernest admitting involvement, conviction becomes certain. But the case has generated so much publicity that finding an impartial jury in Lancaster County seems impossible. The trial is moved out of county. Months of legal preparation follow. Sheets works with a state police officer to refine the confessions, make sure every detail is documented, every piece of evidence cataloged. The defense will argue the confessions were coerced, that the polygraph examination was improper, that their clients are being railroaded by a community hungry for vengeance. But the physical evidence supports everything Ernest confessed. The blood patterns, the position of the body, the wounds themselves. Medical examiners can reconstruct the attack from forensic evidence alone. The confessions simply fill in the human details. The why and how that science can't fully explain. The trial finally begins in 1983. Both defendants pled not guilty despite their confessions. Their attorneys argue diminished capacity, troubled childhoods, the suffocating atmosphere of religious communities. They paint Jimmy and Ernest as victims themselves, young men driven to violence by circumstances beyond their control. The prosecution counters with the facts. A premeditated attack, a defenseless victim, brutal, sadistic violence that lasted long enough for either defendant to stop. 16 stab wounds, each one a choice, each one an opportunity to show mercy. They showed none. The jury deliberates. The verdict comes back quickly. Guilty, both defendants. Murder in the first degree. The sentencing hearing follows. The defense pleads for leniency. These are young men. They can be rehabilitated, given another chance. The Huyard family, in accordance with their faith, doesn't argue for harsh sentences. They've already forgiven. That's between Jimmy, Ernest, and God now. But the judge sees it differently. 2 young men conspired to murder a defenseless woman, assaulted her, stabbed her 16 times, hid her body and pretended to search for her, showed no remorse until faced with overwhelming evidence. Life in prison, both of them, no possibility of parole. They will die behind bars, just as Naomi died in that basement. Jimmy Lee Hare and Ernest James are transported to state prison. The Hare family house sits empty for years afterward. John and Lillian can't bear to live there anymore. Can't walk past that basement door knowing what happened behind it. They move away. Try to find peace somewhere else. Their daughters scatter to other communities. Raymond, Jimmy's brother, changes his name. Tries to escape the shadow of what his adopted sibling did. The Amish community struggles to process what happened. For 245 years, they've been safe, separate, protected by faith and isolation. Now one of their own has been murdered, not by an outsider, not by someone from the English world, but by a neighbor, someone they knew, someone whose parents attended Mennonite church and lived by similar values. The invisible wall between their world and violence has been breached. Naomi is buried in cemetery, a simple grave, a plain marker with just her name and dates. No elaborate epitaph. No angels or flowers carved in stone. The Amish don't believe in such displays. Death is part of God's plan. Grief must be borne with humility. Several hundred people attend the funeral. Horse-drawn buggies line the cemetery for a quarter mile. The service is conducted in Pennsylvania Dutch. Hymns sung without musical accompaniment. Prayers offered for Naomi's soul and for her killer's souls in equal measure. Some whisper about the Hare house in the years that follow. Claim to see lights in the basement windows after dark. Hear sounds that might be a woman crying. The Amish generally don't discuss such things. Superstition has no place in their faith. But a few admit, quietly, that they avoid walking past the property at night, that something feels wrong there, that the ground itself remembers what happened. The case haunts Rick Sheets for years. He goes on to prosecute major criminal cases across Pennsylvania. Murder for hire, corrupt politicians, outlaw motorcycle gangs trafficking methamphetamine. But Naomi Huyard stays with him. The fragility of her body, the brutality of her death, the senselessness of it all. What did those 2 young men gain? A few moments of violence, a lifetime of imprisonment. And they destroyed not just Naomi, but their own families, the trust of an entire community, the sense of safety that had existed for centuries. Jimmy Lee Hare and Ernest James remain in Pennsylvania State Prison. Decades have passed. Jimmy is in his 60s now. Ernest approaching the same age. They've spent more years behind bars than they spent free. The young men who murdered Naomi are gone, replaced by aging prisoners who will never see the outside world again. Do they feel remorse? Do they understand what they destroyed? The prison system doesn't release such information. They exist now only as names on old court documents, photos in archived newspapers, footnotes in the history of Pennsylvania crime. The Amish community recovered, as communities do. Life continues. Seasons change. Crops are planted and harvested. Children are born and raised. Church services rotate from house to house. Buggies still roll down dirt roads. The modern world still presses against their borders, but they maintain their separation, their faith, their commitment to peace. But they remember Naomi, the gentle woman who crossed a road on a cold November evening and never came home. They remember that violence can reach anyone, anywhere. That evil doesn't respect boundaries of faith or community. That sometimes darkness wins, even among those who dedicate their lives to light. November 27th returns every year, the anniversary of Naomi's death. Some members of the Huyard family visit her grave. Place no flowers, as that would be ostentatious. Simply stand in silence. Remember the sister, the aunt, the cousin who was taken from them. Wonder what her life might have been if she'd walked to that freezer 10 minutes earlier or later. If Jimmy Lee Hare had been somewhere else that evening. If Ernest had made different choices. But such speculation is useless. What happened, happened. The only response is faith, forgiveness, and the determination to continue living according to the principles Naomi embodied. The Hare house was eventually torn down. The land sold. A new family built there, people with no connection to what occurred. They know the history, as everyone in New Holland knows the history, but they don't let it define the space. Life moves forward. Even haunted ground can be reclaimed. The garage where Naomi was taken no longer stands. The basement where she died is just a memory now. Only the cemetery marker remains. Cold stone in frozen ground. Naomi F. Huyard, July 2nd, 1932 to November 27th, 1982. 50 years of gentle living. 2 hours of unimaginable horror. And then silence. This is the macabre case of Naomi Huyard, the Amish woman who carried cauliflower across a road and met 2 young men who had abandoned every principle of the faith they were raised in, who murdered her for reasons that make no sense, who shattered the peace of an entire community, who proved that no place is truly safe, that evil exists not in some distant, foreign land, but sometimes right across the street, in the basement of neighbors, in the hearts of those you think you know. Naomi Huyard's death marked the end of innocence for Lancaster County's Amish, the first murder in 245 years. A wound that healed but left scars. A reminder that faith is tested not by abstract theological questions, but by real violence, real loss, real grief. And the Amish response, offering forgiveness to those who showed none, remains perhaps the most profound aspect of this terrible story. Asterisk, asterisk. In the months following the trial, the Amish community held special prayer meetings to discuss what had happened and how to move forward. The church elders, gray-bearded men who had guided their congregations for decades, struggled to make sense of this violation. They had always taught that separation from the world would protect them, that living according to God's commandments would create a hedge of protection around their communities. But Naomi had lived perfectly according to those commandments, and she had been murdered anyway. How do you reconcile faith with such brutal reality? Asterisk, asterisk. Some of the younger Amish, particularly those in their 20s and 30s, began to question whether complete isolation was really possible anymore. The world was pressing in. Television antennas were appearing on nearby English farms, broadcasting images and ideas that seeped into Amish consciousness despite their best efforts to ignore them. Cars drove faster on the rural roads, forcing buggies to the shoulder. Tourists came in increasing numbers, cameras clicking, treating the Amish like living museum exhibits. And now murder had crossed the invisible barrier between the English world and theirs. Asterisk, 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 but the elders held firm. This tragedy didn't mean their way of life was wrong. It meant the world was becoming more wicked, which is exactly what Scripture predicted for the end times. The response wasn't to abandon their principles, but to hold them even more tightly, to forgive even more completely, to demonstrate through their actions that faith could survive anything, even the murder of an innocent woman. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The Huyard family became a living testament to this conviction. Naomi's sister continued to live in the farmhouse across from where the Hare house had stood. She tended the same gardens, collected eggs from the same chickens, attended the same church services. When people asked how she could bear to stay there, to look across that road every day, she gave a simple answer: "This is my home." Naomi would want me to stay. She never spoke publicly about the murder, except to affirm that she had forgiven Jimmy and Ernest completely. Not partially, not with conditions, completely. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Isaac Huyard, Naomi's brother, became something of a spokesman for Amish forgiveness in the years following the murder. When other tragedies struck Amish communities, when the media wanted to understand how these people could forgive the unforgivable, reporters called Isaac. He always said the same thing: forgiveness isn't optional for Christians. It's commanded. Jesus didn't say forgive those who deserve it or forgive those who apologize. He said forgive. Period. If you can't forgive, you're not following Christ. It's that simple and that difficult. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The Mennonite community also struggled with the aftermath. The Hare family had been part of their congregation for decades. Now one of their own had committed the most heinous crime imaginable. Some members wanted to distance themselves from the Hares, to make clear that Jimmy's actions didn't represent Mennonite values. Others argued that abandoning the family in their darkest hour would contradict everything they believed about grace and community. Eventually, the church decided to continue, supporting John and Lillian while also acknowledging the horror of what Jimmy had done. Asterisk, 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 John Hare never recovered from the knowledge that his son had murdered someone in his house while he was at work. He aged rapidly after the trial, his hair going completely white within a year. He developed health problems, stress-related conditions that doctors said were essentially manifestations of grief and guilt. He kept asking the same questions over and over. What had he missed? What signs had been there that he'd ignored? Could he have prevented this if he'd been a better father? His pastor assured him that Jimmy's choices were Jimmy's responsibility, not his. But John couldn't accept that. He felt he'd failed catastrophically, both as a father and as a Christian. Asterisk, 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 Lillian Hare stopped attending church entirely for several years after the trial. She couldn't face the stares, the whispers, the pity mixed with judgment. Some church members were genuinely supportive, bringing her casseroles and offering prayers. Others avoided her as if evil might be contagious. She eventually moved to another state where no one knew her story, changed her name, tried to start over. But starting over at 60 years old with the weight of such tragedy is nearly impossible. She lived another 15 years, dying quietly in a nursing home, estranged from most of her children. Asterisk, 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 the 3 Hare daughters dealt with the trauma in different ways. The oldest left the Mennonite church entirely, moved to Philadelphia, and integrated into mainstream American life. She never spoke about what happened and cut off contact with anyone who knew her family's history. The middle daughter stayed Mennonite, but moved to a community in Ohio where the Hare name meant nothing. She married, had children, built a quiet life far from Lancaster County. The youngest remained in the area, but struggled with depression and anxiety for years. Seeing therapists who tried to help her process the knowledge that her adopted brother had murdered someone in their home. Asterisk, 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 Raymond. Jimmy's adopted brother may have suffered most among the family members who remained free. He and Jimmy had been adopted together as toddlers, raised in the same home, shared the same experiences. Yet Raymond had turned out completely different. He was quiet, responsible, hardworking, and faithful. He'd never been in trouble with the law, never rebelled against his parents or the church. After Jimmy's arrest, Raymond couldn't escape the questions. Teachers, employers, neighbors, everyone wanted to know what Jimmy had been like growing up. Was Raymond scared of him? Did he know Jimmy was capable of violence? Raymond changed his last name legally, moved across the country to Oregon, and refused to speak about his childhood ever again. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The trial itself had been excruciating for everyone involved. The prosecution presented forensic evidence in clinical detail. Crime scene photographs showed Naomi's body as investigators had found it. The medical examiner testified about each of the 16 stab wounds, describing their depth, angle, and sequence. Defense attorneys tried to paint Jimmy and Ernest as victims of their circumstances. But the brutality of the crime made that argument almost impossible to sustain. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Ernest's confession was read aloud in court, every horrifying detail. How they'd watched Naomi through the window. How they'd decided in that moment to attack her. How they'd dragged her into the basement. How they'd assaulted her, bound her, gagged her, stabbed her repeatedly, even after she'd stopped struggling. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the prosecutor read Ernest's words. Several jurors were visibly crying. Some Amish spectators closed their eyes and moved their lips in silent prayer. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Jimmy's partial confession was more self-serving. He claimed Ernest had been the primary attacker, that he'd tried to stop it but couldn't. The physical evidence contradicted this. The blood spatter patterns showed two attackers working in concert. The variety of wound angles indicated both men had stabbed Naomi. Forensic experts testified that Jimmy's claims about trying to stop Ernest were inconsistent with the evidence. The defense called psychologists who testified about Jimmy's troubled childhood, his adoption trauma, his feelings of abandonment and identity confusion. They argued he'd never been properly integrated into the Hare family, that he'd always felt like an outsider, that the rigid structure of Mennonite life had been psychologically damaging for a child with his particular needs. The prosecution countered that thousands of adopted children grow up in religious communities without murdering anyone, that difficult childhoods don't excuse brutal violence, that Jimmy had made choices, conscious choices, at every step of the attack. The verdict came back after only 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Murder in the first degree for both defendants. The mandatory sentence in Pennsylvania for first-degree murder was life in prison. The judge had no discretion. Both young men would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. At the sentencing hearing, the judge made a brief statement that captured the horror everyone felt. He noted that Naomi Huyard had lived 50 years without ever harming anyone, had devoted her life to faith, family, and community, had been doing nothing more threatening than storing vegetables in a freezer when she was attacked. He noted that both defendants had shown no remorse until confronted with overwhelming evidence, that they had hidden her body, joined the search party, and attempted to evade justice. He said he wished he could impose a harsher sentence than life in prison, but Pennsylvania law didn't allow it. Then he pronounced the mandatory life terms, and the bailiffs led Jimmy and Ernest away in chains. The Amish families in the courtroom stood up as one and filed out silently. They didn't celebrate the convictions, didn't express satisfaction at the sentences. They had attended the trial out of respect for Naomi, to bear witness to what had happened to her. Now it was over. Justice, such as it was, had been served. They would go home and return to their lives, and never speak publicly about this again. In the decades since, both Jimmy Lee Hare and Ernest James Huppengarner have remained in Pennsylvania's maximum security prison system. Prison records show both men have been written up for various infractions over the years: fighting with other inmates, possession of contraband, refusing orders. Jimmy has spent significant time in solitary confinement for disciplinary reasons. Ernest has been transferred between facilities multiple times. Neither has ever expressed genuine remorse in any documented statement. Jimmy gave an interview to a prison reform magazine in 1995, 13 years after the murder. He claimed he'd found religion in prison, that he was a changed man, that he regretted his actions. But he still minimized his role and blamed circumstances. Said he'd been young and stupid. Said the system had failed him. Said if he'd gotten proper help after his first arrests, none of this would have happened. He never once mentioned Naomi by name or acknowledged the specific horror of what he'd done to her. Ernest has maintained almost complete silence. He's refused interview requests, hasn't participated in victim awareness programs, hasn't expressed interest in any rehabilitation efforts. According to prison staff who've dealt with him over the years, he's angry and unrepentant, sees himself as a victim of the justice system, blames Jimmy for confessing and implicating him. Prison psychology reports suggest he has antisocial personality disorder and shows no capacity for empathy or remorse. Rick Sheets, the prosecutor, retired from the Attorney General's office in 2014 after a long and distinguished career. In his retirement interview with a Lancaster newspaper, he was asked about the most memorable case he'd ever worked. He immediately mentioned Naomi Huyard, said it was the case that haunted him most, even after prosecuting hundreds of criminals over 4 decades. Said he still thought about her sometimes, about how small and fragile she'd looked in those crime scene photographs, about how much suffering had been inflicted on someone who'd spent her entire life trying to be good and do right, about the senselessness of it all. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The Amish community has absorbed Naomi's murder into its collective memory, but only barely. It's not something they talk about openly. When outsiders ask about violence in Amish communities, they might mention what happened in 1982, but only briefly and factually. The Amish don't dwell on tragedy. They don't define themselves by their suffering. They move forward in faith, trusting that God has a plan even when that plan is incomprehensible to human understanding. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. New Holland itself has changed in the decades since 1982. The Amish population has grown. More farms, more families, more children attending the small one-room schoolhouses that dot the countryside. But it's also become more commercialized. Tourist shops selling Amish-made quilts and furniture. Restaurants serving authentic Amish cooking, run by non-Amish owners. Bus tours bringing visitors from Philadelphia and New York to gawk at people who live without electricity. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The Amish tolerate this invasion of tourists because it provides income. They sell their goods at inflated prices to English people who think they're getting something authentic and pure. But they resent being treated as a living history exhibit. They're not performing for anyone. They're living according to their faith. The constant attention from outsiders is wearing, intrusive, and contrary to their values of humility and separation from the world. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Naomi's grave in Stoltzfus Cemetery remains simple and unmarked, except for a small stone with her name and dates. Grass grows over it in summer. Snow covers it in winter. Occasionally, someone from outside the community visits, having read about the case or seen a documentary. They take photographs, which would horrify Naomi if she knew. The Amish dead are supposed to rest in anonymous peace, not become objects of morbid curiosity. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. But the Amish who visit the cemetery don't go to Naomi's grave specifically. They visit family members buried nearby. Naomi is there, part of the community in death as in life, but not singled out or memorialized differently than any other church member. Death is natural. Murder is evil, but God redeems even evil for his purposes. Naomi is with God now, safe from all harm, beyond all suffering. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. This is how the Amish have chosen to remember Naomi Huyard. Not as a victim, not as a tragedy, not as the woman who died horribly in a basement, but as a sister, an aunt, a quilter, a faithful church member who lived according to her beliefs and now rests in the arms of her Creator. The murder was terrible. The loss was painful. The scar remains, but it doesn't define her. It doesn't define them. Faith defines them. Forgiveness defines them. Peace defines them. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling aspect of this entire case. Not the brutality of the murder itself, though that was horrific beyond words. Not the senselessness of 2 young men destroying a gentle woman for no reason at all. But the Amish response. The immediate, complete, unconditional forgiveness extended to Jimmy Lee Hare and Ernest James Hoopengarner. The refusal to demand harsh punishment or seek revenge. The determination to continue living according to principles of peace, even after those principles had been so violently violated. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Most people can't comprehend that level of forgiveness. It seems almost inhuman. Surely Naomi's family must have felt rage, hatred, a desire for vengeance. Surely they must have wanted Jimmy and Ernest to suffer as Naomi suffered. But if they felt those things, they never expressed them publicly. They buried those feelings, if they existed, under layers of faith and discipline and centuries of theological training that taught forgiveness is not optional. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Whether that's admirable or disturbing depends on your perspective. Some see the Amish response as the purest expression of Christian faith, a living example of what Jesus commanded. Others see it as psychologically unhealthy, a denial of natural human emotions, a community suppressing legitimate anger and grief in service of religious ideology. The Amish don't care what outsiders think. They answered to God, not to public opinion. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. This is the macabre case of Naomi Huyard, a woman who lived quietly, harmed no one, and died brutally at the hands of neighbors she had no reason to fear. A crime that shattered the myth of Amish invulnerability and proved that evil can reach anywhere, even into the most peaceful and isolated communities. A tragedy that tested the limits of faith and forgiveness and revealed both the strength and the strangeness of Amish belief. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Naomi Huyard crossed a road carrying vegetables on a cold November evening in 1982 and never came home. That simple fact has resonated through decades. Thousands of people have lived and died in Lancaster County since that night. But Naomi's story endures because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about violence, about faith, about forgiveness, about what we owe to victims and what we owe to the teachings of our beliefs. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The Amish would say they owe everything to God and nothing to the opinions of the world. They forgave Jimmy and Ernest because Christ commanded it, not because it felt good or seemed just or made psychological sense. They moved forward because standing still in grief and anger would violate everything they believe about surrender to God's will. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Whether you find that inspiring or disturbing, it remains the truth of how the Amish community responded to the first murder in their 2-100- and -40-5-year history in Lancaster County. Naomi Huyard died. Her killers were caught and imprisoned. Her family forgave them. And life continued. That's the end of the story, though not the end of its impact on everyone it touched. Asterisk, asterisk.